Donald Trump says his guilty verdicts are a travesty. Are his fellow Republicans preparing to rip up the US legal system to protect him? Here, Sir Keir Starmer paves the way for Diane Abbott to be a Labour candidate at the election. Why the climb down? Hi, welcome to Newsnight, with you each weeknight with interviews and insight. Our Friday night political panel is here. Sonia Soda, chief leader writer for The Observer, and Tom Harwood, deputy political editor and presenter at GB News. Obviously, we're going to start by talking about Donald Trump, convicted felon Donald Trump. He is angry. A day after his guilty verdicts in that hush money trial, he gave a 40-minute press conference at Trump Tower and said Americans were living in a fascist state. He called the judge in his case a devil, the devil, I should say, attacked Joe Biden and claimed without any evidence his trial had been rigged.
This is a case where if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. These are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put two sentences together. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified. I paid a lawyer, totally legal. I paid a lawyer a legal expense, and a bookkeeper without any knowledge from me marked it down in the books as a legal expense. So this is the crime that I committed, that I'm supposed to go to jail for 187 years for. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened, and they know it. But they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called the non-disclosure agreement. And it all comes out of the White House. Crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of our country. He's the worst president in the history of our country. The most incompetent. He's the dumbest president we've ever had. He's the dumbest president, most incompetent president, and he's the most dishonest president we've ever had. We're dealing with a corrupt government. We have a corrupt country. Our elections are corrupt. Our borders are open. Our borders are going to be closed very soon. November 5th is going to be the most important day in the history of our country. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, let's speak to a man who's watched American politics for 35 years. He's Republican pollster Frank Luntz. Thank you very much for talking to our audience. You've got your finger on the pulse. How is America feeling? How are you feeling?
Well, I'm feeling as afraid as I've ever been.
Afraid?
Afraid. It's not a matter of demonizing someone or delegitimizing. We are now dehumanizing our opponents. There is no low that Republicans will not stoop to in attacking Democrats, and Democrats will not stoop to in attacking Republicans. We've stopped seeing each other as human beings, and now we're just numbers. And this anger and this frustration, this division, it is toxic, and it is destroying democracy. This is the #1 place for news on the face of the globe, the BBC. And it is here that either we stand up and say, stop, enough, or we could lose our democracy.
How do you get to that apocalyptic thought after this jury has found Donald Trump guilty? And you will have your Democratic US presidential election in November.
And it's amazing to me because 34 counts, felonies. And you've seen the judicial system, the legal system, politicized. Because what they charged Trump with is not what they've charged any other president who's had similar issues, and yet Trump does not accept. And the way that he responds to these attacks is to be as vicious. He calls himself a political prisoner. I've fought for decades to see political prisoners released. Donald Trump is not a political prisoner. That said, the way the Democrats have treated him, the way that he treats them, the way that voters now can't talk to each other anymore. We've got, what, 6, 8 feet between us? In America, we have no reason. We fight with each other. We destroy each other. We try only to win. It is not the next election that is important. It's the next generation. Why is it that so many young people are so negative, so pessimistic, believe that the future of the country is suffering? It's because their parents and grandparents are behaving so badly.
What we've seen in the last 24 hours is the US legal system doing what it does. 12 men and women, peers of Donald Trump, listened to all the evidence. They found him guilty on all those charges. Now he will appeal. So the system is working, is it not?
The problem is the public doesn't see it's working.
Right.
Yes, I agree with you, and I accept the substance behind it, but the issue is the perception. 85% of Americans say this is the most divided that we've ever been. Over 90% of people who are over age 65 say so. We believe it's toxic. It's no longer divisive, it's now toxic.
Right. I know you've done a couple of focus groups since those guilty verdicts came in. What are people saying in terms of their sentiments?
They were upset that these charges were even brought. They thought that they were politicized, and I want to use the word that they use, weaponized. That said, most of them thought that Donald Trump was guilty. So don't bring the charges up. If you do bring them up, he's guilty. Do not send him to jail. This does not disqualify him from being president because they don't think this is significant. The other challenges against him, the charges against him, those are significant.
We're just showing pictures of your focus groups now. Why were they saying to you, don't send him to jail?
Because they don't believe that this rises to the level of jail time, and that's the whole point. Everything now is a crisis. Everything now is explosive, and we can't just sit and talk to each other and negotiate with each other and cooperate with each other. And I'm advising you this. They're afraid that on Election Day we're going to have violence. I've never heard voters ever say to me that they believe, and it's more the Trump people than the Biden people, but it is happening on both sides, that they believe that people are going to take to the streets and they are not going to accept the results of this election. And God help the people in the UK if you follow us. This is my warning to you. You're heading there during Brexit. The same challenges we have in our democracy now is happening with you all back in 2018, 2019. You fixed it. And I'm trying to deliver a wake-up call to the media and how you cover it. And congratulations to the BBC, because what you did is you played Donald Trump unedited for about 2 minutes at the beginning of this program. That means you're serious. That means you're showing people, without demonizing him, you're showing what he had to say. Now, what he had to say is something I've never heard before. He uses language that no president has ever used. And if we continue to dehumanize each other, then how do we find common ground?
Thank you very much for talking to our audience tonight. Frank Luntz, thank you, Republican pollster. We're going to talk now to Elizabeth Pipko, spokeswoman for the Republican National Committee. That's the party's main fundraising and campaigning body, which also runs the Republican National Convention, where Donald Trump's set to be confirmed as their candidate in July. Thank you for talking to us. I don't know if you heard the end of what Mr. Luntz was saying, that focus groups have suggested to him that there could be violence on the streets of the states after your US presidential election in November, as a result partly of some of the language that Mr. Trump is using right now.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't say I share the exact same concerns. However, I'm concerned about what's become of my country. I certainly am, and it's not simply because I saw what I saw yesterday as someone in the position that I'm in now, the reason I'm with you, but it's because I'm an American citizen, a proud American citizen whose parents gave up everything, left the former Soviet Union so that I could be born here, hoping to never have to see what I saw yesterday, hoping to never have to sit with you tonight and hear the words that I just heard Mr. Luntz speak about, to hear that there are people debating whether what happened yesterday was a weaponization of our legal system, something that should never have happened. There's a real lack of faith in the institutions in this country. We're talking about the legal system, obviously, because of what we saw yesterday, but also we're talking about Congress, the Supreme Court, our media, so many other things. So I think Americans are completely polarized.
If you're worried
so
too,
divided.
Forgive me for interrupting, if you're worried too, doesn't that mean Donald Trump has a responsibility to calm things down?
I think he has a huge responsibility, but his responsibility is to the American people. And he's angry. They should be angry too. What happened yesterday was not okay. I wish to God that what happened in 2015, when he announced that he was running and the whole world turned against him, did not happen. And then we wouldn't be where we are today, right now. But for what he has gone through, the attacks that have come his way, what I've seen happen to him the last 8 years, I would not blame him. I would not blame anyone for being angry. And I think, honestly, the American people shared that sentiment. They're furious.
Right.
The response that we saw yesterday.
Well, when you say they're furious, but yesterday, what we saw was 12 men and women, peers of Mr. Trump, listen to all the evidence from both sides, week after week after week, and they came to the decision that he was guilty. That is how your system works.
It is, and the question is whether our system is working as it should or whether it's being used. I think it's a fair question to ask. I hope to God that you're right. I hope it is just our system working as it should. But the risks that we face if it's not are...
Mr. Trump is going to appeal, so although he said the outcome yesterday, the trial was rigged, he's still using that system for his appeal.
He is. I don't know if he has any other choice, but what we're not paying attention to is what happened before the trial was brought, right? There are countless irregularities in this case. This case also was looked at by several agencies who did not want to bring the case. The case was only brought against President Trump when he decided that he was going to run again for office, and it was also brought by a very, very political
it doesn't
DA,
matter.
Alvin Bragg.
Forgive me, Elizabeth Pimco, for interrupting. It doesn't. All that is history. In the end, that jury listened to every second of evidence and came to their conclusions independently.
Right, but the case was also incredibly unusual. It was based on untested legal theory. It was brought in New York City after people asked for the case to be moved. They asked for a different judge. They asked for countless things, and they were continuously denied.
Let me look to the future.
I think Alvin...
Let me look to the future, if I may. Again, apologies. If Donald Trump does get re-elected, would you expect him to target or direct the offices of state at the legal system to exact some kind of revenge?
I do not expect President Trump to target anybody. I expect him to come into office and do what he said, which is to unite this country, to bring success back into this country, and to unite us around success. The only thing that can work to put this country back on its feet. Look, you've interrupted me 4 or 5 times now. I understand you have a show to finish and we don't have that much time, but people are genuinely concerned. What happened in this case, I understand the result that happened yesterday after 6 weeks of a trial makes sense, but unless you saw what happened before that, unless you heard the countless statements from Alvin Bragg saying that he was taking this job, running for this office solely so he could target Donald Trump, I don't know if you'd understand the amount of concerns that half this country, if not more at this point, share.
When he was president, didn't he encourage his Attorney General to target his political opponents?
I don't think that he did, and I don't think anything that he has done will compare to what we have seen from this administration and what we've seen from this district attorney, from the Attorney General in New York as well, from countless political leaders across this country since Donald Trump left the office of the White House, I think less than 4 years ago right now. I don't think anyone has been targeted like he has. I don't think our system has ever been used the way that it's been used by this administration and this political DA right now.
Thank you very much for talking to our British audience tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, let's talk about politics there and here. It's the end of the first full week of campaigning ahead of our general election. Let's get insight from our political panel, Sonia Soda, who is chief leader writer for The Observer, and Tom Harwood, deputy political editor and presenter at GB News. Front page of the Daily Telegraph tomorrow is a quote from Boris Johnson saying that the case against Trump should never have been brought, and actually it's going to help him win re-election. What do you think?
I think there's a fair bit of analysis there to make. Number one, this is widely seen to be the weakest case against Trump. And a bit of accounting about hush money paid to a porn star. It's the sort of thing that you'd expect Trump to be doing. It was sort of priced in his victory all the way back in 2016. Perhaps what would have been the more pernicious case to draw, and I perhaps shouldn't have used that word, but what would be the more advantageous case to draw would be the Florida case, the Georgia case, I beg your pardon, which is, of course, about about the whole process of that presidential election, those lost votes, trying to engineer a different result from the one that people voted for.
That's coming down the track.
That's coming down the track,
others, yeah.
But here's the problem, right? This first case was arrived at, and so Trump can just say they're trying to go after me, it's all the sort of stuff, it's locker room talk, all the rest of it. And
Boris Johnson is saying that.
And I think that there is some merit to the argument that this case should not have been brought, and instead that we should have been talking about the disgraceful attempts from Donald Trump to overturn the last election. But instead we're just talking about Stormy Daniels, and that's what drags this debate down.
Sonia Soda, it is possible that Donald Trump will be re-elected. It is possible that Sir Keir Starmer could be the UK Prime Minister. That's an ex-Director of Public Prosecutions, potentially in a room shaking hands with a convicted felon.
Absolutely. Well, if Keir Starmer finds himself the next Prime Minister of this country, I mean, he will have to work with Donald Trump, and he's already said that he will. I mean, there's absolutely no way that the Prime Minister of the UK could not, try and have a constructive relationship with the President of the United States. So I think that that's something that we will see. I think what will be quite interesting is what that means for the sort of politics of the Labour Party if Labour are in government. So I imagine, we've been seeing some tensions in our own general election campaign around Keir Starmer's relationship with the left. I imagine that it might be a source of tension within a Labour government, that relationship with potential President Trump.
Sure. OK, let's talk more about the first full week of campaigning then across the UK. Here's a flavour of the last few days. Any minute now.
They haven't given a reason for banning me. They just want me excluded.
The whip has obviously been restored to her now, and she is free to go forward as a Labour candidate.
For all these reasons, austerity, Brexit, the cost of living crisis, for all these reasons, the Tory government deserves to be removed from office.
I fell in 5 times. They were not all intentional, but it was a serious message that sewage is a big problem.
My mum died in 2020, height of the pandemic, a month after you attended a gathering where you got a fixed penalty notice.
And I'm sorry for what was going on in Downing Street. And for my part, I apologise.
Tom, what does the way Sir Keir Starmer has handled the Diane Abbott case this week tell us about what kind of Prime Minister he might be if Labour win?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to ask. I think asking a question about how this is going to affect the general election, I'm not sure it's going to affect the general election all that much. But it does raise questions about how Keir Starmer in number 10 will operate, how he will balance the various issues within the Labour Party and the various factions, the warring factions within the Labour Party. There's this eternal civil war, it seems, between different groups within that party. When Corbyn was in charge, he tried to kick out certain people. Now the other lot are in charge, they're trying to kick out other people. They never really settle down, but perhaps what was most interesting is where Keir Starmer over the last 3 or 4 days, or at least people around him, tried to take someone out and failed. And that shows that perhaps he's not all powerful when it comes to making decisions. Perhaps he overstretched and was then kicked around by the union bosses and by Angela Rayner.
So I think there's a big difference between Diane Abbott and then some of the other left-wing candidates that have been excluded. And I think Diane Abbott was handled quite badly. I would agree with Tom. I don't think this is going to have massive implications in terms of the election. We've already seen a few polls in recent days. They can't fully capture the extent to which this has cut through, but the indications are this hasn't made a big dent in Labour's poll ratings. The thing I would say, though, is it was ever thus. So under first past the post, both political parties are very broad churches. Every Labour leader, I used to work for Ed Miliband back in the day when he was leader of the opposition, every Labour leader has to manage a party. It's actually, I think, much more difficult in opposition to manage that broad church sometimes than when you're in government.
And so how do I mean, if you were marking him, how do you think he is managing that broad church?
Well, I would say on Diane Abbott, it's been handled poorly. And I don't think that there are many people around Keir Starmer who would privately try and make the case that it had been handled well.
And is it him or is it the people around him?
I mean, I think it's always going to be a mixture, right? But I think if you look more broadly, in terms of the handling around kind of candidates, there's a lot of complaints from the left of the party about people being parachuted into seats late, about certain candidates of the left being excluded because of complaints about conduct online. This always happens, and I would say actually it shows that Keir Starmer is quite effectively thinking about what kind of parliamentary Labour Party he wants. He's thinking, you can see from some of the candidates the party have been involved in selecting, they are selecting some very highly able candidates. They're thinking about, if we're a two-term government, who do we want to be? Who do we want to be in our cabinet?
How this is happening, because there are some people who have discovered. Well, let's take one case: Lloyd Russell Moyle, Brighton Kempton MP, up until dissolution. The day before dissolution, an anonymous complaint about his behaviour was brought against him. He's not allowed to know who's made this complaint. It dates back 8 years, and because that process has now kicked in, he's not allowed to stand for that seat. He's not allowed to clear his name. He'll be out of a job as an MP for the next however many years the next Parliament runs. That is a gross extension of power.
But I think you can criticise those sorts of processes, and I don't think that, they're not necessarily the processes that I would defend, but every Labour leader, in fact, every party leader, does use these kinds of processes. So, for example,
every party leader uses anonymous complaints.
If you look at under Jeremy Corbyn, for example, there was a key Keir Starmer ally, Sally Gimpson, who was selected by a local party and who was deselected very, very late in the day as a result of complaints. So, unfortunately, politics is quite a dirty business. Things happen like this. I don't think it's unusual.
In terms of the Diane Abbott case, it has overshadowed a number of their announcements this week, has it not? Whether it's GB Energy, whether it's easing the pressure on NHS waiting lists. And Keir Starmer today said she's free to go forward as a Labour candidate. Could have done that
how
24 hours ago, 48 hours ago.
All of these announcements from Keir Starmer this week, none of them are new. They're things that he's announced before. Yes, there's slightly more detail towards. Of course, he said he's going to get down NHS waiting lists. GB Energy was announced, of course, at the conference in September. These are all repeating. And this is why it matters, though, right? Because no one's listening to this general election campaign. He could say anything on policy. No one is listening. The country has made up its mind. The polls haven't budged. They haven't budged for months. Rishi Sunak has announced basically one new policy every single day. It hasn't shifted things. People are glazed over. This is not an election about policy. This is an election about punishment.
But this is a reflection of the sort of general election campaign that Labour are very intentionally running. So they are playing quite a risk-averse strategy. That is intentional because they want to convince voters that they can deliver. And therefore, they don't mind if they get tarred with the brush of promising incremental change. They are going for exactly the opposite strategy of Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, where it was a kind of bells and whistles manifesto, lots of expensive pledges. People liked the pledges. They didn't believe Labour could deliver it.
Understood. Right. Let's talk about what the Conservatives did announce this week. A compulsory national service, the Triple Lock Plus, and a crackdown today. They announced on antisocial behaviour and fly tipping, arguably policies that appeal to a certain demographic, not this demographic, though.
Right, do you want to vote? Yeah, I was just going to ask, why do you hate young people so much? You're making us go to the army, you're making us...
No, you'll have a choice. You'll have a choice.
I've volunteered all my life and
then you will love it. You will love it.
Why do I have to do it again when I'm finally coming out of education? And then
because I think a culture of service... I wouldn't do it like that. A cultural service is a good thing for our country. And you'll have a choice.
You're waffling.
So that happened today. I wonder if that young man was watching Newsnight on Tuesday when we spoke to Conservative Secretary of State for Transport, Mark Harper. Compared to what you've done for pensioners, look at what you've done for young people. You're going to force them to do national service. You've tripled their tuition fees. You froze the threshold at which they have to start paying back their student loan. You've extended the student loan repayment term from 30 to 40 years, meaning many graduates will be paying off the debt in their 60s. You invested only a third of what was recommended by the catch-up czar to help kids catch up after the pandemic. Rents rose nearly 9% in the last year, and houses are at their most expensive since 1876. That's why I ask, Have the Tories got a problem with young people?
No, not at all. That's why, for example, we've cut national insurance contributions for working people. That applies to everyone who works for a living. We've increased the national living wage to a record level to make sure those on the lowest incomes have had significant rises.
You are under 30, Tom Harwood. Do you think the Conservatives have given up on young people?
Yes.
Do you?
It's evident. They obviously have. This is a core vote retention strategy. Anyone under the age of 50, dare I say it, anyone under the age of 64 doesn't matter to the government right now. They've looked at the polls, they've looked at all of the new polls that are out, and I think I should mention that there is a new poll out this evening. It was sponsored by GB News and the Daily Mail. It's from Electoral Calculus, and it shows what would be the largest Labour majority in the history of the country. The Tories going down to below 100 seats. This matters because this is a quite special form of poll, one of these big 10,000 voter polls using what's known as multi-level post-stratification regression analysis. Now that's incredibly complicated gobbledygook, but it's all about individual level polling seats and stretching that out across the country. That is terrifying for MPs, and that's why there is not a strategy from the government to win this election. There is a strategy to mitigate losses.
I would totally agree with that. And the other thing I would say is actually when you see this kind of poll, you might think that, you know, people in Labour HQ would see it and be jumping up and down in glee. They certainly won't be. They will find it quite worrying as well, because I think the biggest risk for Labour, coming back to some of what Tom was saying earlier about a kind of anti-politics mood in the country, the risk is that people see these polls with Labour 20 points ahead and they either think, Labour are going to walk this, don't need to bother going out and vote, or I can go out and vote as I voted in the local election, so I don't need to think about voting tactically in a Westminster two-horse race. I can vote Green or I can vote Independent. So Labour are very, very worried about complacency setting in amongst voters. Labour are going to walk this, therefore we don't need to get out and vote for them. So they're not going to be that pleased.
The luxury to be worried with a 25-point poll lead. When Tony Blair won in 1997, he won with a 12.5-point poll lead. Now, everyone's looking at these polls and projections of seats and going, the Tories couldn't possibly get below 100 seats. Well, then you're going to have to explain why the Labour Party is currently polling twice the lead that Tony Blair managed to get. Are all of the polls wrong? Or is there something completely broken about how we're...
Before this massive poll came out, I know you've got some messages from Tory MPs on your phone. I had a conversation with one Conservative MP who called the week thus far an SH1T show, and that's before this poll came out.
Yeah, I've had people messaging me who you would think had their seats guaranteed, some of the safest seats in the country, who want to know the detail of these new polls seat by seat, just to see if the Tories are below 100 seats that were held in 1997 would be lost.
You can see that level of despair, I think, in the campaigning activity that's going on. So, you know, this very much is an election campaign that's being fronted by Rishi Sunak. Other cabinet ministers, you know, some of them aren't. You've got David Cameron, who's on holiday. It does really feel like the Conservative Party have given up.
Sir Ed Davey looks like he's on holiday. He is living his best life. What is the political strategy behind some of these stunts?
I actually think it's quite a smart strategy, because if you're the Liberal Democrats and it's a campaign where there's one party way out in front in the polls, there's no prospect of a hung parliament as far as people are looking at it, your number one challenge as the Lib Dems is to get people to talk about you as a third party. And to be fair to them, he looks a little bit silly in some of these shots. He actually looks like he's having a good time in some of them, you know, sliding down a water slide in a rubber ring. But he is getting the Lib Dems talked about. And some of these shots, you know, there was one of him baking a cake today linked to the Lib Dem policy of free school meals. They are getting the policies talked about more than they would be otherwise. I think any column inches is good news for the Lib Dems, and it's working.
100%. He needs to remind people that the Lib Dems exist. I'm just looking forward to him going ziplining or zorbing or surfing or whatever's going to happen next. It seems to be an endless round of entertainment, which is brilliant for us in our industry. But also, if they were going to announce a new policy on a tax change or some extra spending here or there, we wouldn't be talking about it. We wouldn't have devoted this much of time in the show to it.
It also says a lot about us then, the media. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good weekend. That's it from us tonight. I'll see you Monday. Have a fantastic couple of days.